This video will demonstrate how to read the scale on a ruler. The first thing you want to do when reading a ruler is make sure that you are using the appropriate scale for what you're trying to measure. And rulers typically can have one of two scales, and actually sometimes they have both scales. So the top ruler is only in centimeters. And usually it will be marked for you that you are in centimeters if that's the case. Or you'll notice that the next ruler down is actually measuring in inches. So you very much want to be aware of what scale is being used when you're taking these measurements. Otherwise, your measurement won't be very helpful. Now, for an auto technician, usually you're going to look at the inches scale. It is possible if you're working on a foreign car that it could be in centimeters or some other metric unit. But for this video, we're going to focus on reading a scale in inches. And so if you look at the bottom ruler, you'll notice that there are actually two scales, one on the top, obviously, and one on the bottom. And it is important that you pay attention if your measuring instrument, your ruler, has two scales. So you should be able to look immediately if there are two scales and know which one is the inches and which one is the centimeters, because centimeters are smaller and they are significantly smaller. It takes about 2.5 centimeters to make 1 inch. So definitely make sure when you're taking your measurements that you're using the appropriate scale. The next thing you want to do is determine the scale of your ruler. So you should check that you're using the inch scale, and as you can see on this ruler, it is marked inch. So I know that I'm in inches. Now, how do I know what the scale of the ruler is? Because some rulers allow you to measure to 1/4 of an inch, some to 1/8 of an inch, 1/16, 1/32. So what you want to do to determine what scale your ruler is using is you want to count the number of lines between each number. So to demonstrate this, I'm actually going to use an enlarged scale for you. So let's take a look at an enlarged scale, and notice it just goes from 0 to 1. But you'll also probably notice that a lot of the small lines going across between 0 and 1 have a 16 as their denominator. And so you probably guess that the scale here is 1/16 of an inch, or that we'll be able to measure to the nearest 16th of an inch using this type of scale. But let's look a little bit closer and just see how we would go about using those lines to take a measurement. So if you were to start at 0, and I'll go ahead and mark that right here. If you were going to just count lines, I wouldn't count the line at 0. I'd start at the next line, and I'll mark that in green. So that first line, I would call that 1, and it would be 1/16, because if I continue to count 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to the end, obviously I'll get to 15 right there that I've marked in green, and then one more would be obviously 16, but we know that 16/16 is actually 1. And so when you get to that next long line, you are at the next full inch, in this case, the first inch. So you can really think of it also in terms of just sort of starting at 0 and counting the jumps. So the first jump from 0 to 1/16, that would be a distance of 1/16 of an inch. Now you'll notice when they go to the next line, they didn't mark it 2/16, although that's what it is. They went ahead and reduced it to 1/8, and you should do that also. And then, of course, the next line that I see is 3/16 of an inch. That doesn't reduce. The next one would be 1/4 of an inch. Now that's 4/16, but again, they reduced that to 1/4, which makes sense. And of course, they're going to follow that protocol all the way across. So every time there's an even numerator, like 6/16, for instance, they're actually going to call that 3/8. Okay? So basically what you're going to do is just start at the 0, line your object up, and count how many lines beyond 0 you go, or how many lines beyond the next whole number you go to take a measurement. And we're going to demonstrate that for you in just a second. So take a look at the two rectangles that I have lined up with my ruler. We'll start with the blue one, and you'll notice that my ruler has two scales on it. We talked about this earlier. that the top scale is the smaller scale, so that tells me that's centimeters. The bottom scale is larger, has more space between each number, so that's my inch scale. And if you look even closer, you'll notice that 1 inch on the bottom scale, where my 1 inch mark is, that lines up pretty close to what would be 2.5 inches on the centimeter scale. So I'm going to use that bottom scale, the inch scale, and I can see from my mark now that my rectangle, the top side of my rectangle, goes beyond the 1 inch mark. So I know that my measurement is going to be at least 1 inch in length, but it looks to me like it goes one more line beyond that inch that I've marked. And so the question is, how much does each of those smaller lines represent? So I know I'm going to have a 1. And then how do I know what each smaller line represents? Well, I go back and I just count like we did earlier. How many lines are there between 0 and 1? And if I make that count, starting with the first line beyond the 0, calling that the first line or 1, and I count up to the 1, I'm going to get 16 there. And so that tells me that the space between each of the smaller lines between 0 and 1 represents a 1/16 of an inch. So if I go one more line beyond the 1, like I have with my blue rectangle, that's going to be 1/16 of an inch, which will not reduce. So my final measurement here is 1 1/16 of an inch, and I'll go ahead and box that in, okay? So let's take a look at a smaller rectangle, the red one. Now notice it starts at the 2, so I have to remember that I didn't start at 0 here, I started at 2. And I don't even make it all the way to 3. So clearly my measurement is going to be less than an inch. And the question is, how much less? Or how far is it between the 2 and the line that my rectangle ends at? And I'll go ahead and mark that right there. And so what I can do is start by counting the first line beyond the 2. I'll mark that also. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I've got 10 over 16, and again 16 is my bottom number because my scale is to 1/16 of an inch. And now I look at that and I say, well, 10 and 16 are both even, so I know this reduces. And I know that I can divide by 2 when it's an even number, so half of 10 is 5, and half of 16 is 8, and I know I'm in inches, so my length for the top side of my red rectangle is 5/8 of an inch. So let's look at another scale. Now, if you look closely at this scale, you'll notice that between each whole number, there are not 16 lines. And in fact, if you count, you'll find that there are only 8. And what that tells me is that this particular scale, if it were on a ruler, first of all, it would be in inches because I see the IN, and it would allow me to measure objects to the nearest eighth of an inch. So it wouldn't be as precise a measurement as the scales we were looking at earlier. But let's take a look at this and see what we can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly pick a line, and this first line I'm going to color it green, and we're going to see if we can determine what that measurement would be. So this first green line that I've marked, obviously it's past the 0, but it's not all the way to the 1, so it won't even be a full inch in length. Now I know that I've got 8 lines between each number, so that tells me that my bottom number will be an 8, and the top number will be determined by how many lines past the 0 I am. So I'm going to count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm 5 lines beyond, so that's 5/8, which does not reduce. I'm going to put an IN after it for inches. And so my first measurement in green is 5/8 of an inch, okay? Now I'm going to pick a different color. I'm going to choose blue, and I'm going to mark just sort of randomly a line in blue. And I notice that the line that I've chosen is between the 1 and the 2. So it's past 1 inch, but it's not to the 2, so I'm going to have 1 inch as my whole number. And then my fraction, again, I'm going to have to count the lines beyond the 1, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my top number is a 6. I know because my scale is in eighths that the bottom number is an 8. Now this one, you'll notice, will reduce because 6 and 8 are both even, and that means that I can divide by 2 top and bottom and get 1/8 and 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to put my IN to indicate that I'm in inches. And so that would be the measurement of where the blue line is marked. Okay, so let's do one more. We'll mark this one in red. And so if I go, I'm just going to sort of randomly pick one. Let's see, right there. Okay, so let me darken that a little bit better. There we go. All right, so this last line in red, it's beyond the 3, but it's not to the 4. So I'm going to go ahead and put a 3. And then if I count the lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 6 again. So 6/8, which I know from my last example will reduce to 3/4. And so the measurement from 0 to that third line, the red one, is 3 3/4. And I forgot to put my units. I'm going to stick those outside. It's inches. So you do want to remember to record the scale and whether it's in inches or, say, centimeters, so that someone looking at your measurements, it's clear to them what scale you used. All right, so you'll notice that I have a website here, and if you go to that website, it will allow you to practice more readings with rulers, and it's actually set up like a game. There's a timer and everything, so you can test yourself and maybe even have a little competition with one of your friends if you want to see how well you are reading rulers. I hope this helped, and have a good day.